And welcome everyone to the Liberal Democrat History Group meeting on liberalism in the United States. I will hand over to Leila Moran, MP.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan. Good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be with you. And a welcome respite from the as ever mad day that I've had in the Houses of Parliament in different ways. I've just come from a virtual meeting in Liam Fox's enormous office because I'm sponsoring his private member's bill on Down syndrome. And it just goes to show cross-party working can always happen regardless of what one may think of certain views of our opponents. And I think this sort of brings me to why we're here today, which is to discuss American liberalism in its various forms. And it's absolutely fascinating to have our two guest speakers here today. I hope I speak for all of us when I say that I have an insane fascination with American politics. I always have done. In so many ways, it drives an international agenda that does seep into Britain and vice versa. And we have a lot to learn, if nothing else, by comparing and contrasting liberalism here and there. But it's also true to say that American liberalism has a very different flavour to British liberalism, not least because in this country, if you stand outside in a crowd and say, I am a liberal, wouldn't be considered something that would be an insult. And yet in America, it does seem to be sort of bandied around and thrown away in a way that just doesn't happen over here on this side of the pond. So to make some sense of this, where it's come from and perhaps where it's going, and I really look forward to taking your questions, we have two really interesting speakers, and I thank them both for being here. The way I'll do it is I'll introduce our first and then let them speak, and then introduce the second when we get to hear them speak. So first up, for around 15 to 20 minutes, if possible, but I'm not going to be draconian about this because I'm no doubt that what you have to say is incredibly interesting and worth hearing. Perhaps if it hits 25 minutes, I might start waving at the screen gently. But first is Dr. Helena Rosenblatt, and she's an intellectual historian with a particular interest in political and religious thought. She received her BA from Barnard College and her MA and PhD from Columbia University. And she is a professor of history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and teaches in PhD programs in history, French, and political science, and at the MA program in liberal studies. And her most recent book, which I've decided I need to buy because I just love this title, is The Lost History of Liberalism from Ancient Rome to the 21st Century. So Helena, take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and for inviting me today to talk about one of my absolutely favorite subjects, and one that I think you'll all agree is important today at a time when liberalism is under threat all around the world and going through what we can call as an existential crisis. So I do think we can learn from history. I can't really predict the future or give any concrete advice on how to fix the situation, but I do think understanding the history can help us clarify. It can give us some perspective on our current problems based on previous similar problems, and also clarify what we mean by liberalism. If we have conversations about liberalism and everybody has his own definition, then we talk past each other. And so anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. And the topic is, I was asked to talk about early American liberalism. And I think that's kind of funny because I'm going to be a little controversial here, as I am in my book, and I'm going to kind of contest the whole idea of an early American liberalism, because I think we're used to hearing that liberalism is an Anglo-American tradition. Most people speak about John Locke, maybe Adam Smith. John Stuart Mill always plays a key role. Some people even go back to the Magna Carta of 1215, and they talk about these deep English roots then, and then how the idea sort of spread and became richer during the Enlightenment, when it was then sort of transported to America, imported there, and found a place in the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution. And from there on, America becomes the defender and the exporter of liberalism around the world. This is a story we hear repeated, or is kind of almost in people's subconscious even. And I would like to say that that's just a complete myth. The truth is that liberalism emerged only in the early 19th century and in reaction to the French Revolution. The word liberalism was coined in or around 1812. The first theorists of liberalism were not John Locke or Adam Smith, but Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant and the group around them. Their core concepts were the rule of law, civic equality, constitutional representative government, a number of individual rights, among which probably most importantly, I would say, was freedom of religion, then freedom of speech and assembly, and property rights, yes, but they were never on top of the list. And there was debate about laissez-faire, as we say, free market, free enterprise, how much government should intervene in the economy. So there was no real consensus on that, nor can we say that liberalism in the beginning, or I would say any time in its history, has been a set of codified or a list of principles sort of cast in stone. Liberals have disagreed about just about everything besides these core principles I just told you about, but from the appropriate extension, how many people should have the vote, whether women should have the vote, whether about the economic policies, for example. So there was always disagreement among liberals. And I'm sorry, but I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So I hope you can all hear me. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I'll keep talking, and then shout at me if you can hear me. So it's what I wanted to say is not one thing. It was contested from the very beginning, continued to be contested over the course of its history, and continues to be so today. And it also evolved over time. But from the very beginning, from then when the word was coined, it was considered a very French thing. You'll find this, and it's quite amusing to see that in newspapers, in England, in America, in encyclopedias, and so on, it's often spelled like libéral, has an accent on the E, or it's printed in italics to sort of show how foreign it is. It was also considered by many a kind of dangerous thing, since it was so revolutionary. And so there was another reason to distance oneself a little bit from the word. It was Jacobinism, it was revolutionary. And in fact, I should say, interestingly enough, when the word was first coined in 1812, referring to the principles that I just told you about, it was really a term of contempt. It was a swear word almost. It was a pejorative. Liberalism, like many isms in the 19th century, it was a pejorative word, a smear word. And to its opponents said it was synonymous with anarchism, with atheism, with just license. It was too much freedom, too promiscuous. I have in the book, I have some wonderful quotations, I think, of the Pope, for example, or the popes throughout the 19th century, describing liberalism as, devil worship, basically, very, very strong words to describe what liberalism is. And then liberals themselves trying to say, no, that's not what we are. Eventually, they start using the term themselves. But for example, Madame de Staël or Constant, even though they called themselves liberal, and Constant sometimes called himself the head of a member of the Liberal Party and was considered as such, and the word liberal applied to their thought, they really avoided using this term liberalism. And you don't find it in Tocqueville. And you don't find individualism either, which is also considered a bad word, a synonym for selfishness, basically. So first thing then is that let's think of moments in the history of liberalism. Now, the first moment was this French moment, I would say, when the concept was first theorized, the word was invented, and that lasted a few decades, I would say. And then the second moment, mid-19th century or so, is a German moment. Now, this whole story has really been written out of history books, right? Because how could Germany have a liberal tradition after 2 world wars? Nobody wanted to recognize that fact and said that it's really has an illiberal culture and an illiberal tradition. But the truth is that Germany also contributed a great deal to the evolution of liberal ideas. And it did so in a number of ways, the main one being that political economists, German political economists, a new school of them, began to speak for government intervention in the economy. They began to say that laissez-faire, free market ideas were basically not working. I mean, it's great, it's abstract, they called it. They say it looks good on paper, but hey, you know, we have poverty, we have not only poverty, but endemic poverty. There was a new word coined at this time. They love to coin words in the 19th century, pauperism, for people who are basically stuck in poverty. And people saw this in England and eventually in America too, that urban industrialization, urbanization was leading, yes, it was generating a lot of wealth, but also great disparities of wealth, and that there were these people stuck in poverty. These German political economists, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, carry on.
You can? Okay, all right. So these, I just heard some static or something, sorry. So these German political economists said the government needs to step in and provide essential social services regarding health, education, welfare, unemployment. And this is some in England and, well, mainly in England, and other places too, but let's focus on England, started to call themselves social liberals or liberal socialists and found no contradiction in that. They thought that it was perfectly okay to be a socialist liberal, liberal socialist, that the state should intervene in the economy to help the poor. They should be able to, they should help give the poor the capacity and thus the opportunity to be free. Now, this word capacity is very important to look at for just a second, because we must realize that liberals were not Democrats. From the very beginning, people like Benjamin Constant, Madame de Staël and their circle and others did not think giving the vote to everyone was a good idea. Certainly not to women who were regarded as dependents, and certainly not to very poor people who they thought could not think in terms of the common good. They were too focused on staying alive, basically, and on their own particular interests, that they could not think they didn't have the time, and they didn't have the property, the money to educate themselves, and so they shouldn't be given the vote. In the course of the 19th century, some people then say, well, we should enable them to have the capacity to rise up and to make money so that eventually they could vote. Now, so this is basically what we call new liberalism, what's going on now. And they started to call it new liberalism or social liberalism or liberal socialism, as I said. And when this was happening, there was a branch of liberals who said, this is terrible. This is not liberalism. You're completely perverting the whole idea. this is not what we stand for. We are classical liberals, they said. We are the true liberals. We are the orthodox liberals. We believe in free market ideas. And they actually became advocates of laissez-faire, small government, if you will, to an extent that people before had not. They became more radical about laissez-faire. They said, we never really tried it. We need to go, full hog and just no government intervention. This is really when you have the splitting of liberalism into two streams. The American philosopher John Dewey spoke of two streams of liberalism, one that was for greater government intervention and one favoring free markets and laissez-faire, laissez-passer. And this is really when it happened, you've noticed that in America, in colloquial parlance, liberalism means kind of big government, right? Government intervention, welfare state, welfare policies at least. Whereas in most of Europe and the rest of the world, liberalism stands for freer markets, smaller government. And I'd say this is when it happened. Different reaction to urbanization and industrialization and the plight of the poor. Different ideas about how to deal with this situation. So I've spoken about the first moment, which was the French moment, if you will. Now it's the German moment when these thinkers had a great influence. Their books were translated, newspaper or journal articles were published, translating essays. And a lot of American students went to Germany to university, thousands. And there they learned stuff took ideas from Bismarck, who was introducing health insurance and vaccinations to make the population healthier and stronger. So this was the second moment, I would say, in the history of liberalism. We still haven't talked about America, you'll notice. But now I'm going to tell you about the third moment, which I really identify not before the early 20th century, which I would say is the moment of Americanization of liberalism. So the word in the political sense only came to America and was disseminated there in the first decade of the 20th century, imported by a group of reformers that called themselves Republican progressives in 1912 and Wilsonian Democrats in 1917. I believe that Wilson called himself first a progressive and then changed to a liberal pretty soon. This was America was industrialized now too, seeing the same sorts of problems that England was seeing. By 1890, a third of the nation's 65 million citizens lived in cities and towns. There was great hardship and strikes. Income inequality was skyrocketing. This kind of sounds a bit familiar. The top of 1% of the country earned more wages than the bottom 50% and held more in property than the rest of the country combined. So it was in this context that this new meaning of this word liberalism was imported to England and disseminated by these Wilsonian Democrats, progressives, and people, particularly journalists in the circle of the New Republic, the famous periodical, which is still in publication today. Now, President Wilson seems also to be one of the first, if not the first American to use the word liberal to describe a certain American foreign policy agenda. During his Peace Without Victory address in 1917, he claimed to be speaking for liberals and friends of humanity. And while en route to the Paris Peace Conference to sell his 14 points, he declared that liberalism is the only thing that can save civilization from chaos. Excuse me. And yet these two versions, these two streams continue to exist in America. Not everyone took the new liberal route. Herbert Hoover, for example, who was president and presided over the stock market crash, he said he was a true liberal. Liberalism was about small government, laissez-faire attitude. But he got very angry when FDR used the term to describe the New Deal. And excuse me, it became like a battle, an interesting and quite funny battle, I would say, between FDR and Herbert Hoover and their followers about who owned the term liberal. What did liberalism mean? And eventually, Hoover had to sort of admit failure. And there's this lovely quote where he says, "Oh God, all right, then you can have the word, it's just, you've just polluted it of all meaning, take it. And FDR then becomes really the kind of embodiment or the icon of America's liberalism, that kind of interventionist liberalism that we still think of today. Although there's still people today, for example, the libertarians who, and I have friends among them, good friends, who say that they are the true liberals. They are the classical liberals. And some are not shying away from the term, right? There is a whole group of them, and I sometimes debate them, we have several debates online, if that interests you, who are saying that they want to reclaim the word liberal for themselves. But anyway, in the 1940s, FDR appears to have won the battle. In a speech in 1944 nominating Roosevelt as the candidate for president, Wallace used the word liberal 15 times to describe FDR, calling him the greatest liberal in the history of the United States. So that's pretty much, I'm supposed to end with FDR and turn it over to James, but I do want to just say a few more things. I don't know, I think I'm doing all right with time.
You're doing great, carry on.
Okay, thank you. That was the moment of the Americanization of liberalism. But I have a few more things to say then. So again, American liberalism, like liberalism around the world, has no codified body of ideas. There have been debates about a number of issues throughout its history, and it's also evolved in consequence of circumstances as liberals have had to deal with new issues that have come up. Liberals have been pragmatic reformers, basically centrists, incrementalists, but they're for gradual reform, no revolution. They believed in progress and science and enlightenment and in truth, and that truth comes from openness to different perspectives. And I want, one of the points I try to make over and over again, because I think it's worth saying, given the idea we have been sort of taught to, the description that we're used to hearing about liberalism, is that yes, they were for individual rights, but they were as much, the people I've read in early 19th century through until the beginning of the 20th century at least, accentuated and spoke about duties and obligations just as much as rights. You had rights because you had duties. You were meant to behave in a way that was morally just, that was for the city, or your commonwealth or your republic, and not be selfish. That's also why, this term individualism was an aspersion cast at liberals often, and that they shied away from. They would call it individuality is a good thing, and not individualism, because individuality could mean improving yourself, improving your character, learning, and also, being magnanimous as opposed to selfish. So the idea of that liberalism is so much about individual rights and so much about property rights in particular, to me, I don't mean to be treading on James's territory now because he's picking up the story from FDR on, but I would say, and perhaps he disagrees with me, it'll be interesting to hear, that this is really a result of Cold War and the rise of America as a great world power and the Anglo-American alliance. This is when we start hearing people saying liberalism is an Anglo-American tradition. And we don't hear any more about the French contribution or the German contribution, but we just hear about the Anglo-American tradition and how liberalism is all about individual rights and property rights. It's then that John Locke becomes a founder of liberalism because, of course, he's strong on property rights. Americans needed to show the world what they were fighting for in World War, particularly against totalitarianism, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, to teach the soldiers and to teach the world what America stood for. They were for individual rights. You cannot go down the slippery slope of socialism, and they needed to show a difference with socialism, and distinguish American liberalism from socialism. And so I think that's really where so much emphasis came on individual rights. One last thing I perhaps should say then is that we may discuss this, my method, but I wrote my book thinking there are so many different definitions of liberalism out there, not just the one where in Europe it's, it means the world, it means small government. In America, it means big government, supposedly, colloquially. But people have different founders of liberalism. Some even mention Hobbes or Machiavelli, and they talk about this one and that one. And I found that it's not really doing history. That's deciding for yourself what liberalism is, and then going back into history and sort of cherry picking different ideas and lining them up in chronological order and congratulating yourself that, oh, well, now it all adds up to me and to my view of liberalism. And I think a lot of historians, with all due respect, have been doing that, just kind of cherry picking from the past ideas that add up to their own view of liberalism. So what I wanted to do was something very different. I said, okay, well, what did people at the time say liberalism was? What did liberal mean to the first people who used the term? What did liberalism mean to the first people? And they're the ones who used it, pro and con, so to speak. What did the first liberal party stand for? And that's what I try to do in my book. And you get to these very surprising conclusions. You come to them, the ones that I think I've shared with you today. Perhaps I'll end there. I'd love to talk about this. I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Helena. That was absolutely riveting. And I've no doubt that there'll be loads of questions. And certainly my mind is racing from a lot of what you said. I think there's something lovely about the idea that each individual picks their own liberalism. It just seems very liberal to me. But we'll now move on to our second speaker. So James, thank you so much for being with us. James Traub, I hope I'm correctly pronouncing that. Let me know if I'm not. Is a journalist.
Leila, you were giving the more elegant English pronunciation of my inelegant name. So yes, please, stick with the one you used.
Cool. I prefer that. Oh, okay. Whichever works for you, honestly. Is a journalist and scholar specializing in international affairs. He's the columnist and contributor to the website foreignpolicy.com, and as foreign affairs spokes, I definitely go on that quite often, so thank you. He has worked as a staff writer for the New Yorker and as a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. James teaches on American foreign policy and on the history of liberalism at NYU Abu Dhabi and at NYU. And his most recent book is What Was Liberalism? The Past, Present and Promise of a Noble Idea. James, over to you.
Well, Leila, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here. It's actually been very useful to think about what I was going to say to you, because it clarifies the thoughts I'm having for the book I'm writing right now, which has to do with Hubert Humphrey. And I thought that what Helena said was so clarifying in a couple of important ways. One is that there you all are, liberal Democrats, and that expression liberal Democrats tends to make us think that liberalism and democracy are kind of the same thing. And so what Helena really clarified is they have two very different genealogies, and they come in very different forms. And I think the other thing, obviously, that was so important is freeing liberalism from this notion that the real liberalism is laissez-faire, and then there's all these fake liberalisms, as Herbert Hoover would have had it, which isn't so. But the period I want to talk about is actually a time of not only liberalism as liberal democracy, but liberalism in a coherent way, a kind of less scrambled way, but a very distinctly American way. And that's the post-war, post-FDR period. And I want to start with what I consider to be the origin story of this post-war liberalism. And that begins with the foundation in March of 1947 of the Americans for Democratic Action, which is founded by the historian Arthur Schlesinger, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, the labor official Walter Reuther, and others. And it is formed explicitly as a liberal anti-communist organization. It is the beginning of what came to be called Cold War liberalism. And the founding text of the ADA was actually written, in effect, the informal founding text, a year later, when Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book called The Vital Center. And the probably most important assertion of the vital center was that communism was not a kind of overzealous and misbegotten form of socialism, but that it was a form of totalitarianism equal in evil to fascism, but much more dangerous because it appealed to the romantic left-wing sentiments. It appealed profoundly to the wish for human equality and social justice. Schlesinger was trying to carve out a new space. And he says in that book, the vital center is the place between the abyss of totalitarianism and the jungle of private enterprise, meaning that the wish for equality cannot allow us to be beguiled by totalitarianism, and the wish for individual liberty cannot allow us to descend into social Darwinism. That was the space of this Cold War anti-totalitarian liberalism. And it was very much provoked by something which was probably even more common in the UK and in Europe than it was in the United States, which was the tremendous appeal or glamour that communism had for many intellectuals and artists. And in the United States, that took the form of lots of popular front groups that were not themselves communist groups, but that were quite overtly open to communism. And especially the rise of Henry Wallace, who Helena mentioned quite briefly, who had been FDR's vice president until 1944, and then worked for Truman as Secretary of Commerce, and broke with him, and broke to the left, and ultimately founded what was called the Progressive Party. And there was a real fear that liberals would decamp to the left and that they would become soft on communism. So that's the background. Now, the figure I want to put in the foreground is my guy, Hubert Humphrey. So Hubert Humphrey was also a founding member of the ADA. He was a crusading liberal, progressive mayor of Minneapolis. He was 37 in 1948. He was made vice chairman of the ADA, and he had made his name in the ADA world because he had stood up to the local party in Minnesota, the Farm Labor Party, which had a very strong communist side to it, really among kind of university intellectuals. And he had broken their stranglehold. And he'd formed a new party called Democrat Farm Labor, which was communist free. And so Humphrey was sort of putting into action as a political actor the kind of ideas that Schlesinger had talked about and the ADA was founded on. So in the spring of 1948, ADA officials approached Humphrey, who's now a rising figure. He's going to run for Senate in Minnesota. And they say, we want you to champion a progressive civil rights plank for the platform of the Democratic Party at the upcoming convention, 1948 convention, that summer. So why did they do that? First, because civil rights was plainly the great unfinished moral issue that had not been addressed by the New Deal. FDR had kept away from that because he knew he couldn't get any serious civil rights issue through the Congress when the Senate was so strongly not dominated, but shaped by Southern Democrats. So it had been ignored. The year before, in 46, Truman had appointed a commission, a civil rights commission, which in 1947 had delivered a report which called for putting an end to having a federal anti-lynching law, ending the idea of a poll tax, establishing a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission to prevent discrimination in jobs, a civil rights commission, and so forth. So they said, Hubert, we want you to propose this plan. And again, a very important part of the motivation was Henry Wallace, strong on civil rights. We're afraid he's going to attract Black people. If he runs in 48, he'll attract the left. The Republicans will win. We've got to steal his thunder. So Humphrey goes to Philadelphia in the summer of 1948 and comes under tremendous pressure from Harry Truman's own people. Though Truman had appointed this commission, he knew that civil rights politically was a loser because half of his party were people whose whole lives were based upon Jim Crow laws, upon segregation. and they would not accept it. And they said, Hubert, don't do this. We're going to agree on some watered down plank. And Hubert has a kind of dark night of the soul. And he's wavering. He wants to be a team player. He's ambitious. But he wakes up on the morning of July 14th and says, whatever this costs me, whatever this costs the party, I have to do it. And so he delivers this incredible speech that night, really the greatest speech of his life, where he says, here's a sentence or two. He says, the time has arrived for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the sunshine of human rights. And then he says, people, human beings, this is the issue of the 20th century. And for him and for the ADA and for really American liberals, it was. This led to an incredible outburst. You can listen to the tape recording still. Stomping, cheering, screaming, singing, a parade goes on, and they then take a vote. Now, here's a very important, not usually noted element of all this, which is by this time, millions of Black people had moved from places where they were not allowed to vote, that is to say the South, to places where they were allowed to vote, which is, say, the North. And so suddenly Blacks were seen as possibly holding the balance of power in major American states, in Illinois, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in New York. And so at this convention, the political bosses, people who ran big city machines, who were hardly liberal, they lined up behind Hubert and the ADA because they saw suddenly Black votes mattered. And so it carried, it won. And this was a thunderous, astonishing victory. And I want to explain why, for these Cold War liberals, civil rights seems so brought together these two essential elements of the liberal commitment to social justice and the anti-communist crusade. Because what was really central to this notion of Cold War liberalism was that the Cold War at bottom is an ideological struggle. It's a struggle of ideas as opposed to a struggle only of armies or of diplomats. And the only way the United States could win that struggle was by demonstrating that democracy worked better. And if you hear in this echoes of what Joe Biden says today, that democracy has to prove in the face of authoritarianism that it can deliver, it is exactly the same notion. We are living through a new moment of that. And so in every speech Humphrey gave for the next decade, he reiterated that notion. I'll just read you one tiny example from a speech in one of the many unsuccessful attempts to get this Fair Employment Practices Commission as established. He said, on it hinges not only the true fulfillment of our democratic heritage in America, but the prestige of democracy in the world, so long as men and women and children of color are discriminated against in the United States, the colored people of the world have the right to suspect our professed friendship for them. Civil rights, that's how we win the Cold War. Now, I think one of the important conclusions from this is if you want to understand why American post-war liberalism looks really different, not just from the kinds of, you might call right-wing liberalism that Helena described, that is to say, free market liberalism, which clearly is part of this, by the way. I mean, these Schlesinger and others, they're deep believers in the free market. So is Hubert, but they believe in a social democracy. So as social democracy is gaining apace throughout Europe, in the United States, that thing, that's what the New Deal was. Harry Truman's Fair Deal, which was building on the New Deal, expenditures on public health, education, housing, that's there. But what makes American liberalism so distinctive and what gives it both its heroic and its tragic aspects are the way in which it is tangled up with these issues of race and of the Cold War, and thus of America's place in this immense global struggle. That is the distinctively American aspect of post-war liberalism. Now, as we know, both those things stalled. They didn't happen in the 1950s. And they didn't happen, first, because Southern Democrats prevented them from happening. And second, because people like Hubert, who believed that the American people would demand these forms of social justice, were wrong. And the idea that we could only win the Cold War by showing our commitment to social justice at home people didn't accept it. And so for the next 12, 13, 14, 15 years, depending on how you want to count, that Cold War liberal agenda didn't succeed. But it's very important, I think, in talking about the United States. Now here, I don't know whether Helen or I will disagree or not, to distinguish between liberalism as a kind of national state of mind and liberalism as a political program. And so that 1950s world, if you were a 1950s historian, like Louis Hartz, there was this notion, and this is Lockean, to use Helena's language, that America was just a genetically liberal country. Or Lionel Trilling, public intellectuals, who would say, America has no conservatism, that's alien to America. We're just liberal by our nature. That was true in some fundamental sense. That is, Dwight Eisenhower as president never turned against the New Deal. He simply accepted it as part of America. And liberals always accepted the virtues of the free market, even though they wanted to curb it with more government activism. So the vagaries of liberalism as a political program go in and out, even as there is some fundamental baseline of American liberalism for a very long time. So now I'm trying to move this forward chronologically. So John Kennedy then succeeds to the presidency, and Kennedy is not a civil rights liberal. The issue had never interested him. And like Truman, he thought it's a loser. He was kind of a fair deal liberalism. He wanted to extend the role of the government in a number of areas of social good. But his big domestic issue was the tax cut. And of course, his big issue is not domestic issues at all. If you read his famous inaugural, 100% of it is about foreign policy, about the Cold War. He had a romantic vision, as the Cold War liberals did, of what the war against the Soviets would mean. And it was really only in May of 1963 when there was terrible violence in Birmingham, Alabama, in which the sheriff of Birmingham, Bull Connor, set police dogs on peaceful demonstrators. And everyone in America saw that. It was only in the aftermath of that and of a public reproach from Martin Luther King that Kennedy finally introduced a Civil Rights Act in June of '63, and really did very little to promote it until the time he died in November. Who knows what would have happened if Kennedy had lived? But of course, he's replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who is profoundly consumed with this and then pushes it through. And one thing I want to say before I move forward a little bit is that there's a big question in the United States right now, prompted by something called the 1619 Project, which asks about, which says that white liberals have kind of written Black people as agents out of the civil rights struggle. And the fact is, it is Black people who have been the chief agent of their own emancipation. And I think if you look at the interplay between the world up here of national politics and the world down here of civil rights activism, it really is true that absent the spectacle of the unearned suffering of civil rights activists, this stuff wouldn't have happened. It didn't happen because people like Hubert Humphrey believed it should happen. It happened because they made people not like Hubert Humphrey, who weren't committed to it, they made them accept it. It's a very important moment in thinking about that relationship. So in the mid-1960s, there is this second high point of liberalism. The New Deal is the first. The second one is the so-called Great Society. And Congress passes the Equal Opportunity Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, this amazing raft of things, creates all these programs that later become famous, the Job Corps, Head Start, Vista, Legal Services. It's an astonishing moment. And really, Hubert says later, we have now achieved in the 1960s what were the ADA resolutions of the 1950s. And it's true. And it's an astonishing, remarkable moment of government activism. And yet, in 1968, this same fellow, Hubert, runs for president and is humiliated, not because he loses so badly, but because he's abandoned by the left. He's rejected by the ADA. He's despised by many people in the white working class, and of course, he's defeated by Nixon, and he's crushed. He is the incarnation of liberal, and he's crushed. So, what's this about? You know, why does liberalism seem to fail the moment it's achieved its great success? That didn't happen at all with the New Deal. The New Deal stalled in effect after FDR's first term, after 36, but it was deeply institutionalized. It didn't create a backlash. So this does happen in this case. And I think there's a couple of important things to think about here. One is a thing that applies to all social democracies or aspiring social democracies, which is creating targeted benefits as opposed to universal benefits is a very, very difficult thing to do. So the New Deal, many of its benefits could be said to be targeted in the sense that they were for unemployed people, but that was the great mass of the country. FDR was appealing to people's self-interest. Vote for me and I'll do something good for you. LBJ was not. LBJ was appealing to people's conscience. Vote for me and I will finally do what America has failed to do. That is an intrinsically very hard thing to do. Now, I don't think it created a backlash against the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. I don't think there was a backlash against the notion of Black equality. In the South, yes, not in the rest of the country. But the war on poverty had an inevitable zero-sum aspect. That is to say, we're going to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to make whole the people who have unjustly suffered for generations. And in some cases, the desegregation of schools or of housing or of unions, hiring halls, you had to say to people, yes, it's true. This comes at a disadvantage to you, but there is no other way.
Would lay his head and imagined the family were dressing for the occasion.
Okay, so there was no other way of making people whole. And so George Wallace, who ran in the 1968 campaign, went to town on this. He was able to exploit the idea that these white liberals, these liberal elites, this is the first time, well, not the first time, but maybe one of the most effective times we hear this language until Donald Trump comes along, who uses Wallace's language to a T. These people are gouging you. He doesn't even explicitly run a racist campaign. He doesn't have to. He just sends those messages. Though I think it wasn't totally race. He also ran, and people were very angry about, what they call permissiveness. The kids, the 60s. He ran against what we now call the 60s, this kind of cultural moment. He ran against law and order. And Humphrey became seen as the incarnation of all these things. But then we come back to Vietnam. Vietnam, you cannot forget about this whole question. Vietnam is fought in the name of Cold War liberalism. First, because it's this idea of containment, which has been the American ideal since World War II, but also a very romantic idea that the United States can and must, and it's in its interest to do, to transform impoverished countries. Vietnam was a very romantic crusade in its early years before it became an unspeakable, horrible slog. And I was just this morning, in fact, reading a speech that Humphrey gave in 1966, where he says something we've all forgotten now, called the Honolulu Declaration, which was some meeting where Johnson met with the South Vietnamese regime and promised billions of dollars in development assistance. And he says that, I think there's a tremendous opening here for realizing the dream of the great society in the great area of Asia and not just here at home. And Vietnam had that aspect. And so there is also a kind of tragic illusion of the ease of transformation which follows that. Layla, how am I doing in terms of time? Because I could stop now, or I could go on for a few more minutes.
Now would be also fine. I think a couple of minutes. A couple of minutes.
Well, no. So I'll just summarize what else I was going to say. Okay. I think the big question this raises in my mind, or one of the big questions, one obviously clearly is about, well, the two, about race and about America's standing in the world. But also, did the Great Society, this great efflorescence of liberal belief, did it fail, or was it rejected because it asked too much of people? And if it failed, did it fail because it tried to do too much? That's essentially the neoconservative argument. Or, as many people would say today, from our own very ambitious point of view, it didn't try to do enough. And that's a very important question as we think about, especially here in the United States, what the state can do and should do in order to cure those problems which have very much lingered from that time to this time. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, James. And I think, already I'm realizing we've got 40 minutes left of this meeting, and we could literally listen to both of you for hours and hours and hours and hours. Before we move to questions, and thank you so much for those who have been putting them into the chat. I warn in advance speakers, I'm going to be asking for shorter answers than so far. So just to be warned. And if there are other questions, do put them in, and I'll try and group them is probably the best way, because there are some themes that are emerging. But before I do that, please can I pass to Duncan Brack to talk a little bit about the work of the Liberal Democrat History Group. Duncan.
Thanks very much, Layla. And thank you to our two speakers. I just want to let people know about the Lib Dem History Group, for those of you who haven't come across us before. We were founded when this party was set up back in 1988 to promote the discussion and research of topics related to the histories of Liberal Democrats and our predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SDP, and of political liberalism more broadly. And we do this in four main ways. First of all, by publishing the regular quarterly Journal of Liberal History. That's the latest issue, which just came out, a special issue on the early 19th century roots of liberalism in Britain. We organise regular discussion meetings like this one. Our next meeting, I can tell you, is going to be at the Liberal Democrat Conference in September. It's an online meeting, obviously, because the conference is online, and we're continuing the theme that we started back with our meeting in February on political rivalries. That one was on Asquith versus Lloyd George. Well, in September, we're going to be looking at David Owen versus David Steele, with people who worked closely with both of them. So I hope for those of you who go to the conference will be able to log on to that one. We publish a range of books and reference books and booklets on aspects of liberal history, and we maintain a category of research resources at our website, liberalhistory.org.uk, and you can find out more about us in the journal and books and booklets there on our website. I would just say that some of you I know are subscribers or have been subscribers to the journal. If you haven't had this issue, which you should have had about 2 weeks ago, it's probably because you've forgotten to renew or you've been too busy with local elections. We have suffered rather from the fact that Lib Dem conferences have been online recently, because normally we recruit and get quite a number of our subscribers renewing at conference at the exhibition stand. So if you just want to check whether you've had it or not, if you think you should have had, it may be just because you haven't renewed. And you can renew most easily online at our website. And if you just drop us an email if you need to check where the status of your subscription. And finally, I would just say if anyone would feel like helping us run all these things that we do, oops, sorry, somebody ringing me. If anyone feels like giving us a hand with all the various things we do, we think supporting the Lib Dem History Group is a worthwhile activity, and do get in touch with us after the meeting. Thanks very much. Back to you, Leila.
Thank you very much. Well, as I said, thank you so much for the questions. There are a few themes, and I'm going to take them slightly out of order because I think that there are some that sort of going to set the scene better than others. And I'd like to start with Lorna Marsden's question, if possible. So Lorna, if it's all right, I'll just read it out. As a Canadian Liberal, this history is fascinating and totally unlike what happened in our country. And I would argue the same from the point of view from British history as well. Why is liberalism so specific to particular nations? And I don't know, Helena, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think that's one of the really strengths and I guess you could also say weakness of liberalism is that it has these thinkers, and politicians certainly, are practical and are looking actually at problems on the ground, the situation, the context, all of these things, and are working from reality. I mean, some people like to think of thinkers as, up there in the sky speaking, Hegel's talking to Locke and this one and that one. But I think that a lot of these liberal thinkers were particularly pragmatic. Often they were political actors. Benjamin Constant was in parliament. And so, of course, the conditions are different. The situation, and they also realize what can be passed and what can't pass, what will be voted for and what won't be. So that would be my answer, is that conditions were different, individuals were different. This is the stuff of history. Things aren't simple or consistent. They're varied. And so liberalism has a rich history. I think I would have loved to work on other countries, but I thought that I had already stretch myself as far as I could. I'm sure Canadian liberalism is a wide open topic as well.
Thank you. James, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I did, but I feel like Helena is the authority on comparative liberalisms, and I'm sure there's a lot of other questions. So we'll just go on to the next one.
Well, thank you. Well, then the next one is also interesting. It's about the idea that the word liberal is attacked. So there's two that are sort of kind of on the same bent. Bruce Meredine says, do the speakers think that liberal is really a dirty word among non-Democrat voters? And are there significant numbers of Democrats, members or voters, who would not describe themselves as liberals? And kind of linked to that is Dennis Loretto's, which is it possible to rescue the word liberal in the USA, or does freedom and fairness need a new description? Maybe James, I'll come to you first.
Well, yeah. So first of all, the answer to are there lots of Democrats who would not apply the word liberal to themselves? Yes. I mean, perhaps the majority of American Democrats wouldn't apply the word liberal to themselves. The word in this country really began acquiring a pejorative reputation, a pejorative meaning, really under Reagan. And then I would say Democrats, reacting to their failure in the 1980s, began to look for new words. And even the word progressive, which earlier had actually had a left connotation, as Henry Wallace was a progressive, people like Mike Dukakis, who ran for president in 1988 in an absolutely bloodless, dismal campaign, would sometimes use that word because liberal had become so poisonous. If I had to guess, I would say it's not worth worrying about whether the word can survive, because a lot of people on the left now in the United States, they view liberal the way people on the left in the 1960s viewed liberal, meaning compromised. And so it's not worth trying to throw that word at them. And if they like progressive more, it's okay with me. People like me or Helena, I think, will continue trying to sustain this word because of its incredibly important tradition. But it just doesn't matter to me that much if people who more or less agree with my worldview call themselves liberal or something else.
Thank you. Helena, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree. I agree with what James is saying. I think one thing we haven't spoken about here that I think is relevant is religion. And I think liberal, in a non-religious context, everyone knows the famous speech by Ronald Reagan, or maybe he did it several times when he spoke about the dreaded L word, which made it suddenly, scary to call yourself liberal. Or over time, the Republicans really milked this, and it became a liability to call yourself a liberal. You could stand pretty much for the same principles, but you couldn't call yourself a liberal. And a lot of people are shying away from that word for that reason. Same thing, actually with socialist in America now. It's like, you do not want to be called a socialist. Perhaps it's the same thing in England. I don't know. It wasn't always the case. But anyway, religion. going, actually the first liberal party that called itself that, and that was called that, were a group of Bostonian Unitarians who were considered themselves enlightened Christians, enlightened Protestants. So these people were wanted to rid religion of excess dogma and ceremony and make it more about morals and comportment, and not so much about mysteries and mysticism and that kind of thing. And those who are against these people will speak of liberalism as this kind of permissive, borderline atheist, slippery slope kind of thing. And there's still this aura, I think, about liberalism of permissiveness. You allow everything. You don't have principles, really. And that's very unfortunate. But is the word's going to be around? It just is. It's shown for its history that it's powerful. It's has some kind of rhetorical force to it. So I think that people will continue to use it, to shy away from it, and I find it actually quite fascinating.